So welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today. This is the regular speaker program of the U.S. Asia Law Institute here at NYU School of Law. And I'm Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director. And we hold regular talks by experts on themes relating to Asia and law. And our topic today is very much about Asia and law, because we're talking about the 2019 protests in Hong Kong and what led up to them and the aftermath. And as many of you will recall, those protests were bookended by a pair of laws. Right? They were triggered by the Hong Kong government's decision to try to pass a law that would allow extradition to mainland China in criminal cases. And after they ended, the government's response was the passage of the national security law in 2020. So there is law is going to be hovering over this conversation, but we're also going to talk a lot about politics and about journalism. So the theme is a new book by a pair of journalists who were in Hong Kong in 2019, the Shibani Mahtani and Timothy McLaughlin. They're the authors of Among the Braves, Hope, Struggle, and Exile in the Battle for Hong Kong and the Future of Global Democracy. So very ambitious title, ambitious scope for the book. Shibani Mahtani is an international investigative correspondent for the Washington Post, based now in Singapore, but she was the Hong Kong and Southeast Asia bureau chief for the Washington Post at the time of the protests. And Timothy McLaughlin is a contributing writer for The Atlantic, who was also on the ground throughout the period. They're a couple. They were in Hong Kong together then, and according to their preface in the book, they had arrived in Hong Kong expecting to spend a lot of time actually outside Hong Kong, using it as a kind of peaceful base for jetting down to other locations around Southeast Asia with bigger stories and more action, and then come back to peaceful, orderly, tidy Hong Kong to have maybe a little bit of writing time, and then go back out into the field in other places. And of course, things did not go according to plan at all. So with that, why don't you give us a little bit of a introduction to yourselves and to the book and why you wrote the book?
Sure. So Shibani and I, that's not the big reveal of the book that we're married, but we were married. We moved to Hong Kong together in 2018. We'd been based in other places in the US and in Southeast Asia reporting, and we moved there in 2018. And as you mentioned at the time, the umbrella movement obviously ended. On the political front, things seemed kind of pretty kind of at a low, I guess. I think our editors expected us to travel around a little bit. There was occasionally, some news from Hong Kong, but at the time, most of the news from Hong Kong was covered by Reuters and Bloomberg, financial journalists talking about, real estate, monitoring the stock market, things like that, which we don't really write about all that much. So there wasn't a huge kind of, demand on us for news from Hong Kong. I think that changed a little bit, or we could kind of start seeing the beginning of it when a lot of these, the bridge, the Zhuhai Macau bridge opened when we were there. There was some sort of, a few controversies kind of started bubbling up with Victor Mallet from the FT was denied a visa. I think you guys remember the Hong Kong Independence Party when they spoke at the FCC. So there was a few things like that, but primarily, we were not spending all of our time kind of there and focused on reporting. Obviously, as everybody knows, that changed dramatically. And I think for the book and what we were interested in kind of putting together was, both of us, though we reported a lot on what was going on, felt like there was still a lot more there and to write about, and we were looking for an outlet for that. Also, I think the way that the protests had ended, not just the national security law, but COVID, it was really, really sudden. It was kind of, and not just sudden in the sense that the protests ended, but sudden in the sense that the global news just totally shifted in a way that, obviously the world hadn't seen before. So it all felt very kind of unfinished. It felt like there was all this stuff still going on in Hong Kong that really wasn't getting paid attention to because COVID had taken over not just Hong Kong, but the globe and the global news. So I think the combination of those things of wanting to put down more and also kind of feeling that things were unfinished were kind of the things that drove us to want to write something longer.
And just to add to that, so when we started conceptualizing this book, I think we knew that we wanted to put Hong Kong people at the heart, or at the center of it, right? I mean, obviously we're not, Hong Kongers. We didn't grow up there, and but we did have access to these just like incredible people with incredible life stories that I think would help readers or people just anywhere, right, contextualize why we saw what we saw in 2019, right? We, everything was so fast paced, from June of 2019 to sort of January of 2020, that I think, it was good to like take a step back and understand like how and why the modern sort of pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong emerged, right? And so, that's why we chose our first, central character, was Reverend Chu Yuming, whose sort of life story takes readers through that early period in Hong Kong, from the handover to kind of migration from the mainland to Hong Kong, and how Hong Kong identity was sort of formed in opposition to that until 1989 happens, and Hong Kong has this very emotional reaction to the crackdown at Tiananmen Square and feels it's its obligation, right, to carry that on and carry on the fight for democracy. And so that's also why we kind of structured the book first around a character that would sort of take us through that history, and then on three young people who were really shaped and formed by 2019.
Did you already know the Reverend Chu? And maybe first explain a little bit, because I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people who are in this room maybe are very familiar, but I don't know everybody online. May not be familiar. Who is Reverend Chu, and how did you come to meet him? And
so he was like I'll before I start, I'll plug. He has a book coming out himself that's going to be published end of the month. That is his memoirs that he's been working on for a very long time. I think it's getting published by a Taiwanese publisher. It should be fascinating. I think super interesting because his life is fascinating. He was born in Hong Kong, and then his family gave him up to his grandmother who was living in the mainland, and then he ended up living there through the very tumultuous times in the mainland, came to Hong Kong as an economic migrant, like many people did at the time, to work, to try to kind of like eke out a living, finds himself, like swept up in the, I guess, religious life, goes to seminary in Taiwan. And I thought for us, he had just such a, like, he had been in so many events. Like if you look back and like, even if you look through like AP archives or something, you can see him kind of in the background of all these photos and all these historic moments in Hong Kong, right? And so,
he's in his 70s now, yeah.
Yes, and so he, and so he'd been involved in Operation Yellowbird, helping people fleeing the Tiananmen crackdown, and came to Hong Kong. A story that is fascinating and still not kind of fully told, I don't think. And then move on to third countries. He was a big part of that operation. He helped out kind of originally launching Umbrella in 2014, along with Benny Tai and some other individuals, and then. His trial was ongoing when 2019 kind of kicked off, and then
his trial
for involvement in the Umbrella movement, and then and then the other part of it was that his son Samuel became involved in Hong Kong activism later, and actually ended up helping out some characters, or some other people that we had reported on, and so we kind of met him. We met his son Samuel first, before we kind of started talking to him a lot for the book.
Yeah, I think it really crystallized this like generational, struggle that Hong Kong has had, right? That what happened in one generation and picked up by another and picked up by another.
Right. And then the three others though are all quite a bit younger.
Yes.
They're all the faces we associate with the protests and with the movement, the young people. Two of them in particular come across in the book as being somewhat disaffected from society, or struggling to find a way for themselves, possibly being representative of what we have been reading for some time about the idea of not a lost generation, that's far too strong, but I guess a generation in Hong Kong of people who had kind of given up hope that there was a future for themselves in the city. Can you talk about that sentiment a little bit, and then also how you met them?
Sure. So like, I think with sort of the young people who were sort of at the heart of the 2019 movement, right? We wanted to kind of make sure that they kind of represented different things about the movement and different things about the protests as they kind of emerged. Tommy, who's sort of one of our main characters, he was exactly what you say, right? The sort of disaffected youth that found himself in Hong Kong where he couldn't imagine owning a home or starting a family because those options didn't seem possible at all with his sort of financial circumstances and what he saw around him, right? And I think there was this sort of like promise of Hong Kong that felt so empty to so many young people, right? And then you're living in this like really modern city, it's the financial center and all of that, but then you look at your life and you see like very few options for upward mobility or pathway forward, right? And I think he really sort of exemplified that to us. And we trace in the book his path to radicalization, really from being somebody who was just kind of like a class clown, joking around, not very like political, not very sort of even academically focused at all, to somebody who then became like really involved and absorbed in Hong Kong's history, and then starts a path to activism from there. I would say that the second character, Fin Lau, was probably somewhat the opposite. I mean, he was in London, he had a very successful career, he was very comfortable financially when 2019 started. He probably represented like that model of kind of the overachieving Hong Konger, right? Who like grows up in a family that maybe may not be that wealthy, but then strives for that upward mobility and achieves that, and like goes overseas and has this pretty comfortable life. But then 2019 happens, and all of a sudden everything changes, right? Priorities changes, focus change, and he threw kind of all of himself into the movement, but online. So he, to us, represented, the online nature of the movement. I mean, some in this room and online might also know that he was kind of the one of the first to introduce the concept of Lam Chao, which was the "if we burn, you burn with us" concept. That really was kind of the kind of mantra or the different sort of the difference between the 2019 movement and in 2014. And lastly, but perhaps actually most importantly, we also wanted to have a character or a person who ends up having to, the choice was very stark in 2021, 2020, after the passage of the national security law, that, if you don't go into exile, your fate would probably be jail, right? And we wanted somebody to kind of help understand like why someone would choose to stay in Hong Kong and choose the jail path when they had that opportunity to leave, but what that kind of sacrifice meant, right? And really, Gwyneth Ho, who was a journalist at the time for Stan News, and then sort of rose to prominence when she was sort of assaulted at the train station in Yunlong on July 21st in Hong Kong. She, really exemplified this idea that like, staying and fighting and having a political platform from prison was a path that some chose, right, by the end of the movement, and sort of tracing her journey from, a student actually who was overseas at the time studying in Europe, to a journalist during the movement itself, to kind of political activist and then political prisoner. I think really helps sort of like round out, the kind of choice and really, really hard choices that people were dealing with at the time.
The four of them, as you said, coming at it from very different perspectives. Do you feel that one thing that struck me in reading it was I was looking for some of the familiar faces in Hong Kong, the pan-democrats, the people whom we've seen for a long time. And did you consider putting them in at all, or do you feel that their role was not significant enough in this movement, or what was your thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we wanted to focus on, or people that we were interested in, were kind of maybe people that in Hong Kong had risen to like a level of being quite well known, like Gwyneth, who like never reached, I guess, maybe like the international status of Joshua Wong or like that type. But in the moment and in 2019, like she was so important to kind of what was going on, and it was a really like central figure. But and there's probably spend a whole long time discussing this, like never the international media and stuff. She did some pieces here and there and got interviewed and stuff, but it never seemed to me like to balance out how well known she was in Hong Kong and how she'd become this figure with like how much she got covered internationally. It didn't really make sense. And then I think, Joshua Wong, someone who, the international media has written quite a bit about, there's the Netflix, documentary and stuff. He was in jail when 2019 started. When he came out, I think him and the other people realized that this was a different situation from 2014 in terms of the leaderlessness that people were striving for. And I think also realized that with his international kind of clout and connections that he would be better served outside Hong Kong. So I mean, I think he spent a lot of time on the international stage, obviously the CEC in Washington, going to the EU. So and wasn't so much like in the city in the way he was in 2014. So I think we wanted to find people that we saw as influential and write about their impact on the movement and on the city from kind of what we had seen being there.
You mentioned this term lam chao, this idea of well, at one point I think you almost defined it as mutually assured destruction, basically. That seems to summarize the violence that emerged over the course of the protest. It didn't characterize all of the protests, to be sure, and even near the end, there were still peaceful marches. Some of the final marches were still quite peaceful, but there was this incredibly violent element throughout. And at least watching overseas, that became one of the most controversial aspects of it, of course. Inevitably, it will become, Could you talk a little bit about what the conversation was on the ground amongst the different segments of Hong Kong society and even the different, I don't want to say factions, but the different groups and perspectives within the democracy movement? I mean, much of Hong Kong society clearly wanted democracy, but how to get there or what to do to achieve it, what would satisfy them obviously was different, right? So some of them would have had probably opposed the violence. Was there a conversation? What was the ongoing discourse about this use of violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think really everything in 2019 changed when on June 12th, when protesters sort of did what they thought they would traditionally do, right, which is what they did in 2014, sat on streets and surround buildings and occupy them. They were met with sort of a police response that was really so unprecedented in Hong Kong's history of protests, right? I mean, for generations, Hong Kong had been protesting in very large numbers, protesting in a way that was, really like family focused, right? I mean, people would bring their children after, to every Tiananmen vigil on June 4th. 2003 was a very sort of carnival-like atmosphere, which sort of continued on every July 1st. And on June 12th, the indiscriminate sort of police response, I think, really shocked people and made them realize, like, okay, wow, we're facing something very different here institutionally. And I think that's when you saw this real shift to kind of like, radicalization, really, right? And that slowly sort of went up and up and up, and Hong Kong, the pro-democracies movement's tolerance for violence, I think, went up and up and up until especially what happened on July 21st in Yangon, where, for those who don't know, right, you had essentially triad gang members carrying, Chinese and Hong Kong flags, indiscriminately beating up commuters and protesters at the subway station in Yangon. And I think that's where you saw this total like institutional like trust in every institution in Hong Kong really collapsed, from the police to the government. And we interviewed at the time people who were like had very normal jobs and were very sort of like white collar, who were learning to make Molotov cocktails, who were learning self-defense. And I think they felt like, okay, we can't trust anyone anymore, so we have to sort of rely on ourselves. And at the same time, there were definitely points where the violence in the movement got too much, and the clear one was what happened at the airport. I can't remember if that was in July or August, where the protesters had sort of not kidnapped, but like tied up two people from mainland China, one of whom they thought was an undercover police officer, and the other one was a Global Times reporter, if I'm remembering that correctly. But you saw very quickly, because this was a leaderless movement and so much of it was organized on sort of online forums where, views were sort of debated and discussed, this sort of like realization that like, okay, we probably need to take a step back and apologize, right? And sort of like, try to course correct a little bit. And you saw that just like happening in real time all the time, right? Like every time there was like an action that people thought was too much, there was a bit of course correction. And, it was very interesting to see like the melding between the peaceful and the more radical, right? That always sort of switched, like sometimes it would be a different gear, sometimes it would be another gear, depending on sort of what form that protest took.
Can you give an example of that happening?
Yeah, I mean, I
The
think,
CHRF marches.
yeah, I think, when CHRF, which now no longer exists, was organizing those, those.
Civil Human Rights Front,
Yeah,
which was the group that's like an umbrella organization that sort of, like took control of organizing, or at least
The
facilitating
logistical
the
part
permits.
of like applying for the permits. So, I think you saw when they were kind of involved in a march, there was a lot of or rallies, there was a lot of respect for the people in charge of that organization. And people mostly abided by their calls to just protest peacefully, to rally.
Because their name was on the police permit, and if something went
Yeah,
wrong,
and then-
they would be held.
Right, and sure, later on in the day, maybe at other locations, things would kick off. But when they're kind of they kind of made themselves known that it was going to be kind of again more family friendly, more nonviolent. So I think there was there was certainly actors out there pushing for different tactics, for different ways. I mean, I think the really remarkable thing too is that now we have, and at the time it was coming out, but now there's even more like a body of academic work that shows that, like, surveys that were being taken in real time, that people were really not split or turned off really to the movement by what took place. There was like a high threshold for more radical actions amongst the general population, which is rare, amongst most movements.
Yeah. Did you or others, were you able to find out what was behind that? Like, was this, you mentioned at one point a particular individual, former member of the police force, or had been in the Hong Kong police during the British colonial era and had stayed on, and you mentioned him as leading up this new group within the force that was referred to as the Raptors, like a rapid response unit of the police, and they often were associated with some of the most violent attacks on protesters. And we also have video and images of them wearing kind of, tactical
Yes.
gear, looking very
Darth Vader type.
very
Yeah.
scary, exactly, and being quite violent themselves, for sure. So did you come to a conclusion that it was somehow, a group of individuals who were responsible for taking the police response in that direction? Or did you come across any information about instructions, specific policies, directions to do this?
I mean, not specific policies from a high level, right? But I think it was clear that like the police in previous protests have been told either by security chiefs or the chief executive that okay, we need to like be restrained, we need to like follow orders, we need to like be very mindful of cameras, we need to be very mindful of the way we act. And there was frustration building up amongst rank and file officers about that approach, even since 2014, and especially in 2016, where sort of the localist protests happened in Mongkok. And we spoke to a police officer who said, even then my colleagues wanted to like fire tear gas and like shoot off rubber bullets, and we were told not to. So in 2019, everybody was kind of amped up and sort of ready to go. I mean, they felt like they already had that sort of like us against them mentality, like kind of baked in already from 2014, right? And I think that kept being reinforced over and over again, that like, you're on one side and you're what's like standing between, total chaos and order, right? And these people want to kill you, they want to kill your families, they want to hurt you, and so, you have to do whatever you need to do to kind of control what you see on the streets. And we were both co-authors of a piece on police accountability, basically looking at how the police had sort of consistently violated their rules in 2019. And at the time as well, in reporting for the piece, the police officers told us that like, before, like every time you fired like a canister of tear gas or rubber bullet, whatever, your superior would make you note every single one of it, right? By sort of the end of June, they were like, do whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
And they were not even like tracking that stuff anymore, or not even making people kind of report in the same way, because there really was this like police force sort of mandate to, do whatever you need to do to control these protests.
How many people, was there ever any credible count made of how many people were injured?
There likely is one probably now, kind of postmortem, but I don't know the figure.
How many deaths? There were at least 3, I think.
Yeah, that were kind of related to the action, which is I guess sometimes to us even like surprising given the level of some of the stuff that was happening, that there wasn't more, that more didn't happen on that end, right? Even like accidentally.
Yes. Yeah, when you watch the videos, you just think, people's heads are being cracked in a pretty serious way. You mentioned the Yangon MTR attack. That's become it was also kind of a turning point, as you said, for trust or lack of trust in the government. It also has come in for a lot of attention, and now there's a trial going on in Hong Kong, in which a number of the Democratic politicians have been accused of crimes, accused of inciting the attack on themselves. There had been an official investigation previously, and then and that got stalled and encountered problems and everything, and now this prosecution. Could you talk a little bit about what you feel is definitively known about what happened there? And maybe just to back up, first of all, what happened? You explained it briefly, but a little bit more. What actually happened, and then what is definitively known about?
So on that day, July 25th, there was a big, because it was Sunday, there was a big protest happening in Central, as there always was, right? Sundays was the big days for protests. And, ahead of that protest, there had been sort of calls and sort of rumors circulating online that triad groups and sort of rural groups in Yangon were sort of threatening that if any kind of protesters sort of ventured near or ventured close to Yangon, they would get beaten up or attacked or whatever. And these were rumors, and they were pretty widespread. But it became clear that something was really going on when a chef who was working at a restaurant in a mall in Yangon was walking home, and he was attacked by a bunch of these men wielding sticks and stuff.
Wearing white shirts. Yeah,
wearing white shirts. And then they continued on to the subway station, where they continued sort of randomly and sort of indiscriminately attacking people. And one of those people was Gwyneth Ho, the journalist for Stan News, who was the only journalist at the station at the time, because she lived there, and she was actually trying to head to the protest that was happening in Central when she was beaten up. She was the only one filming, so her sort of documentation really is like core in sort of us having an account of what happened there. And so that night the police didn't respond in a timely manner at all to like the thousands of calls, literally thousands of calls that were being made for help and for assistance. The trust in the police just sort of collapsed from there. But in terms of what's known, we tried to kind of, we knew that this was such a seminal incident in the 2019 movement. It was so pivotal for how the Hong Kong people saw their government and saw the police, that we tried to push on that reporting a little bit. One of the things we found was that a police officer was actually in a WhatsApp group with 5 of these triad groups that were all talking about organizing essentially the attacks that were going to happen on 721. And so the police obviously knew about it, but didn't take any action beforehand. We also found that the rumors had seemed also to reach government officials as well, who were very slow to respond that night.
Prior to even our reporting, Reuters had put out a story kind of shortly after that. An official from the mainland official based in Hong Kong had gone out to Yunlong, to rural communities, and spoken about defending the community out there. So I think certainly the atmosphere was very charged, and there was definitely a lot of knowledge that something was sort of brewing, though not exactly what.
And more than 4 years on, sitting here, it's really stunning to see the trial, because essentially what they're trying to do is sort of rewrite history and rewrite the narrative for it to be this like gang fight between two equal sides, when really it was a coordinated attack from one side of, just a whole bunch of people indiscriminately, right? And that's what they're trying to do through the courts, and the courts are essentially, going to help prove this narrative, or they're going to give sort of credibility to this narrative, if they, find the people on the other side guilty of assault or inciting violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think in short, what they've tried to do is, to make it like super simple, is that they've said that this was sort of like a sharks in the jet gang fight, right? That the pro-democracy people showed up, these guys showed up and they battled it out in the train station, and that pro-democracy lawmakers, activists were telling people to come, essentially like reinforcements. And it's like, it's sort of staggering that to see them to kind of go after this. I think there's reasons for it. I think it's hugely embarrassing for the police force. It's hugely embarrassing for the government because of their lack of response. And I think that's why it bothers them so much. I think if you remember back, Matthew Chung, who was the number 2 at the time, came out afterwards and said a very mild statement about the police response being inadequate. And he was just railroaded by the police unions, by the rank and file on social media. So I mean, this has been really something, again, probably an incident that I think outside of Hong Kong is kind of, I think everybody remembers the images. It was very shocking at the time, kind of faded, and have forgotten like how much the government is still like obsessed with changing this. And so that's their narrative. And in reality, what we all saw and what was reported at the time was these guys were roaming around for hours, beating people up on the streets. They were not stopped. There was, there was police officers who drove by, who saw them, who did nothing. And then when they started this rampage, then they stopped and they came back and did it again through the course of the night. And going back to it being such like a kind of a nerve for the government is, Bao Choi, Hong Kong journalist, she did a really great investigation on this. They went after her on essentially like technicality. So I think they are really, this is an incident they really want to try to rewrite in a big way. I think it was really shocking when they came out and when they charged these people and they gave their kind of little press conference at the time. One of the people at the SCMP who wrote a recount of the elections that was published of the protests in a book, she tweeted like, I can't believe what I'm hearing, right? I mean, it's really a total twisting of what took place.
When this was going on, what, if anything, was the role of the older politicians? So people like Reverend Chu, and some of the others, Martin Lee, Emily Lau, some of these other, long timers. Did they have any role? Were they able to try to talk to the government? Because of course they had ties with the government. They had entree, presumably. Was there any attempt or effort, or were they also just getting doors slammed in the face?
Yeah, I mean, we spoke to Reverend Chu about this pretty extensively when we interviewed him, and I think by 2019 he sort of felt like this was no longer his sort of moment. But in 2014, he had already feared that if the government kept ignoring people, closing the door and slamming the door and not engaging, you will see violence and you will see radicalization, right? And I think he was very pained and very hurt when he always talked about that, because I think, as a Christian pastor, right, and as somebody who I think really believed in nonviolence his whole life, right, he also found himself understanding, why this was happening, and he always gets very emotional when he talks about it. And I think we have a quote in our books from him saying, we're not fit to criticize them in any way, because we're all, brothers climbing the mountain in our own way, right, which was one of the sort of slogans or mantras of the protest, right? We're all like sort of doing whatever we feel is right in the moment, all sort of fighting for the same goal. I mean, I think we also kind of document in our book in the lead up to the sort of protests or the explosion of mass protests in the streets, how many of the more moderate and sort of long time pandemics, alongside diplomats, alongside heads of chambers of commerce, tried to tell Carrie Lam, the chief executive at the time, to pull this back, right? They kept telling her over and over again. There was so many off-ramps that could have been taken. There was so many things that could have been done over the course of those many months, until things started becoming so out of hand that I think Beijing felt they had to intervene, because they couldn't trust the Hong Kong government anymore to keep order in their own city, right? And those, I think one of those key off-ramps, right, was immediately after the June 12th sort of police response. People just wanted, an investigation into that, and just that day, that one singular day, and then things started piling up so much that it was pretty stunning to see, and I think it was pretty frustrating to go back to that period and interview a lot of people around Carrie Lam at the time, who actually, said on the record, we told her to stop this. Even from her own side, right? Even from the probation camp.
To stop this meaning to withdraw the extradition, the proposed extradition.
Yeah, and I think, back to the original question with the older generation, I think there's a sort of frustration that it was even visible in 2014, and then forward from there, that they had their opportunity. They had tried their way, right? And their way, a lot of it was, they were pushing a lot for kind of, the links between the mainland and Hong Kong, right? That Hong Kong will democratize and then China will follow, and there's a big connection there. That they had tried their way, they had tried through the Legislative Council, and they hadn't gotten anywhere. And I think that what a lot of young people said, you tried, you did your thing, you tried for decades, and what is it? We haven't seen kind of returns on those efforts. And I think, Martin Lee, before he stepped back from public life, I did a very, very long interview with him. Some of it is in a piece that I wrote for Wired, who said the same thing, that I don't blame them, that we didn't achieve what we set out to achieve, that we didn't return the goals that we set out to achieve, that Hong Kong isn't a democracy. And so he echoed a lot of what Reverend Chu told us later, is that we don't fault them for being so angry, I guess.
Right. It's ironic that they are now mostly in prison.
Yes.
Because they seem to not have had much of any role in anything that transpired, which
is, I think, the most stunning thing about the use of the national security law, right? I mean, it was sold as something that would get rid of, what we were talking about, radical elements, people, making Molotov cocktails, people who had, bomb making materials in their home, whatever. That hasn't panned out. I mean, one of the people they went after is the Hong Kong Alliance, right? I mean, they had no clear sort of role in 2019, nor were they ever violent, nor were they ever sort of a problem, for the government, until they decided they were, right? And I think that there was such a punitive element, right, about the way the national security law was sort of used. And, we're talking about law and lawfare. I mean, I think what we saw in the sort of immediate aftermath, right, that their first few targets, I think really gave an understanding of what this law was for, and a lot of it I think was just score settling, right? Things that over generations they just weren't happy with, and wanted to kind of
right. Especially with Jimmy Lai, clearly.
Yeah.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about Jimmy Lai. I mean, he was certainly at some of the protests, at the front of some of them, but he certainly wasn't throwing any Molotov cocktails. And he's been in prison since this August of 2020.
Yeah.
So how do you read the clearly deep and desire to put him behind bars for life?
One we puzzle over a lot between ourselves and between other people from Hong Kong that we speak and meet with. I wrote a story about it for The Atlantic that was supposed to come out when his trial was going to start. It's now been delayed, it seems like it'll be delayed again. And I asked a lot of people this question. I think there's a variety of answers, but he does, seem to bother them in a way that no other individuals do. I think part of it is the money. There's a thought that, he's funding kind of all of this, that his wealth was enough to kind of propel so much, which, it's not a secret that he donated to a variety of pro-democracy lawmakers over the years, and that was not anything that was, that had all come out in various ways in the media and various leaks and other things. So, I think that's part of it. I think his connections to the Trump administration in particular, to US politicians, they found very bothersome. He has very deep connections with the Wall Street Journal in particular, through connections there with their editorial pages, which is, they write about him quite a lot. And so I think those personal connections that for a lot of years, were probably kind of private and things like that. When a lot of those people ended up in the Trump administration, he was flying to DC and meeting with, Mike Pence or Bolton or things like that. That really bothered a lot of lawmakers. It's funny, I think it bothered the lawmakers, it bothered pro-democracy lawmakers on a certain kind of like US, China, Hong Kong meddling level, but it also bothered them on a deeply personal level. You would talk to pro-Asian lawmakers and they would say, they never invite us to go to Congress. They felt deeply kind of like just hurt by it, right? Slighted that they never get to, they're, elected lawmakers, they should be come to Washington and be able to shake hands and they should be able to do this. And that really, frankly, pissed them off. I had many lawmakers tell me that, where's our invite? How come we don't get to go? And so I think there's that personal aspect to it. And so I think there's like a multitude of reasons. And I do really think there is this, and Shibani and I were both there for this, for an interview that none of it really made it into the book, but we spoke to CY Leung before we left Hong Kong at length about Jimmy Lai.
Former chief
executive, who has been, very, very vocal in his time outside of office, and mostly talking about Jimmy Lai. And I think,
Did he bring up Jimmy Lai?
No, he did. Because I wanted to clarify, he brought that up.
Yes.
So he was showing this focal.
We asked a bunch of other questions and he was like, I'm only here to talk about Jimmy Lai.
It was the only thing we could talk about. Yeah. There is a singular obsession.
Write your book about Jimmy Lai.
What was his message? That he was some sort of black hand?
Yes, that since 1997, the British have used Jimmy Lai to destabilize Hong Kong, that he has a British passport that was given to him as a gift to sort of essentially stay and work in Hong Kong as a colonial agent provocateur of sorts on behalf. So I mean, and some of it is and the US. Some of it is like deeply conspiratorial when you start talking to some people about his role. So he does occupy, I think, just like a singular position in many of these people's minds, in a kind of way that's sort of stunning to see sometimes.
And I mean, I think having this sort of like narrative is twofold, right? I mean, one, they go up to Jimmy Lai, but then also they're really disenfranchising the more than 2 million people who came out to the streets and then the millions of others that supported them, right? They're saying that all of you are sheep and pawns and you didn't have any agency and you were all just manipulated by the US through Jimmy Lai and through Apple Daily. It's like very simple to them, right? And so I think it has this like dual role of like removing Hong Kong people of their agency while at the same time going after a mastermind that they have long had, suspicions or issues with.
Well, it sounds a lot like what happened after 1989, right? And so then afterwards, in order to be able, you can't arrest everybody, right? There were 1 million people on the streets.
Right.
In Beijing, there were 2 million at the peak, you say, in Hong Kong. You can't arrest them all. So you have to have some way of sifting them, right? And saying, okay, there's a, handful, 极少数, they used to keep saying, very few enemies. And then the great masses of people who are still patriotic but have been misled.
Yes, misled. Yeah.
And then and of course there is foreign elements in that, but that is the narrative that of course has prevailed in mainland China and Beijing about what happened in '89. So what I'm hearing you say is that's the narrative now for what happened in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and with Jimmy Lai, there's the added part of Apple Daily and the fact that it started publishing in English. Right, that the English part obviously came later, but that he had the financial means, he had the media control,
right.
And through the financial means, he controlled the pro-democracy legislature. So you see this web, right? And if you think that way, I think you can watch it build it out, and you can keep linking the links and making the links, and you do come away, you can convince yourself that, okay, he was this kind of, and it's funny you bring it up. Just yesterday or 2 days ago, maybe, Chris Tang, Security Secretary, did another interview in the SCMP, kind of in a weird way, giving like a trailer, like highlighting what's to come in the Jimmy Lai trial, saying everyone's going to see how evil he was. They're like almost like hyping it in a way.
That's the evidence.
And yes, as this big reveal, right? And
have they explained why they were so determined that he should not have the UK barrister representing him at trial? They've gone to enormous lengths to keep him from having that lawyer.
And I think taking some kind of reputational damage in the legal system in doing so, which they this whatever the national security concerns, if we call that, seem to override that, and they're willing to do this. Their explanation has been that he just doesn't. Well, I guess the official explanation is he does not know the national security law, he's not versed in it, in the local matters. Other more strident pro-Beijing officials and unofficial capacities have come out and said that, it's a national security threat having him, be part of this. But yes, they did go to great lengths. Obviously, it looks very hypocritical because, they tried to use foreign lawyers before in their cases against Jimmy Lai. Yes, so I think it strikes quite a bit of hypocrisy on their end.
The trial's not gonna be closed, is it? It's not
No,
gonna be
it's open.
sealed?
No,
It's
it'll be
open?
open. Yeah.
So in that case, anything that comes out in open trial is open to all of us.
Yeah, and we already know a little bit of what will be in that case.
Yeah, and so, Fin Lau, one of the characters in our book, he was one of the founder behind Stand With Hong Kong, and Stand With Hong Kong emerged from the internet, really, right? It emerged from online forums, from Telegram, but then became this really sort of powerful lobbying group in the UK and in the US, and I think we've already seen from the early sort of statement of facts from the Hong Kong government that they are linking sort of Fin and Stand With Hong Kong and Jimmy Lai and others in sort of big trial to say that these kids who emerged from the internet didn't do anything on their own. They were all guided by Jimmy Lai and led by Jimmy Lai and funded by Jimmy Lai in everything they did. And in some of the reporting Tim and I have done for the book, but also for other stories, we know people kind of involved with that trial who said the prosecution and the police, they've just really been obsessed singularly with finding any links to Jimmy Lai and any of these other groups, right? And whatever they can sort of pull together is what they'll do. And I think one of the things, and this is already in the statement of facts, is that when they crowdfunded these groups, because they crowdfunded online, right? And they used stuff like GoFundMe, they couldn't get the money immediately into Hong Kong to pay for the lobbying of the newspaper ads they were doing. So Jimmy Lai fronted the money to them and they returned it, but that's some of the evidence they're using, for example.
And the cases, it's the Andy Lee and people are interested, the Andy Lee and Wei Lin Chow national security case is the one that the initial proceedings and the statement of facts and things that have come out now. The case almost seems to have nothing to do with those two individuals. So it's only almost solely focused on Jimmy Lai. So I think we're getting a preview of kind of how it will all fit together.
Oh, that's interesting. So I'm going to open it to questions in just a sec, because I'm sure you're all very much waiting to raise your own questions, and also for people online, you're going to be welcome to put your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I just want to ask about one last trial that's currently ongoing that I think has been really underreported, and that's the trial of the editors of Stand News, which was this entirely online, correct? Entirely online publication that had emerged that the editors have been accused of sedition under the sedition provision in the criminal code that has been there for years, but had not apparently been used for several decades.
Yeah.
So it was put in the code by the British. The language in there, I actually looked recently, and there's still a lot of the old language about the crown and the queen and so on.
Yeah.
But, so some of it has been updated, but basically causing the government to come into disrespect is the underlying theme. So anything that you might say or do or be preparing to do that would cause the government to come into disrespect or to cause, I was going to say unrest, but I don't think it quite goes into that direction. It's mostly this theme of respect, that could give rise to a charge of sedition or conspiracy to commit sedition. And so these editors have been accused of that for the material that they published, not that they themselves personally said or created or whatever. So what do you know about where that trial might be going or appears to be going, and why is the big effort being made against Stand News, which was a very small outlet? It was not Apple News.
Yeah, so I think going back to a few points that we've talked about, Stand was probably another thing that in Hong Kong during the protests and maybe to many people in the audience was extremely important, maybe even more so than Apple Daily, though Apple Daily kind of captures the imagination of a lot of the media, the foreign media. Stand, I think, was important because they were kind of at the forefront of the live streaming of the protest that you saw everybody kind of adopt after a while, right? They were the first ones kind of doing this constant live streaming, capturing a lot of, the police actions, just like raw footage all the time. And eventually it would be them, mostly Ronson Chen, journalist for them, was kind of the guy doing it at the beginning. And then eventually you saw so many other outlets shift to this thing. So they were kind of the first people doing that. Gwyneth, one of the characters in our book, was working for Stan News when the Yangon attacks happened, and she was attacked there. She was also at Ledgeco when the break-in happened to capture that. So they were really like at certain places when really big events took place where other people were elsewhere. So I think that bothered the government. I think it bothered the government that they saw Stan as being part of the movement rather than as what objective journalists. That really bothered them as well. And so I think what you said is true about the case is that it's been very like undercovered, outside of Hong Kong because it has huge implications on the press there. Some of the court documents, some of the testimony is frankly like a bit farcical. It talks about like, this seditious content and things and conspiracy, and the conspiratorial meetings they discuss are just editors talking with reporters, like these really boring editorial meetings that every journalist has had to sit through. They're not really like this is not really conniving, like scheming, but that's kind of the way they've presented it. And then the third part of it that I think is interesting is the use of sedition. Like you mentioned, you've seen this huge rise in that, and originally in Fast Beat, Tom Chi's case, you saw them kind of meld the national security law and sedition together. I think that was the first case where we saw an idea of how it would be used in the future. I don't think people thought it would go to this length where they're using it so frequently. But they did, some think tank, government aligned people telegraph this. They said that they would start, the way they always phrase it is activating unused laws, because I think they are pained to admit that they're using colonial laws because their big part of their thing is decolonizing Hong Kong, right? That it's too westernized and they still have this colonial mindset there and they love the British. But it's like, yeah, but then you're using all the old British laws, so when we're using it, it's okay. When it was used against Cao Kong Pao and back in colonial times, there was outrage, in China. So there's a lot of, again, hypocritical elements to this. And then, I don't know if you have more to add on Gwen's role. I think she, Stan became a big part of her kind of identity. Whether she liked it or not is another question.
Yeah, and I think Stan News was also like, it was a newsroom that was very like close and sort of collegial, right? Because I think they saw themselves really being birthed in opposition to the government. They were formed out of House News, which closed down or sort of was forced to shut because of pressure right before the umbrella movement, and then they sort of reconstituted as Stand. But the relationship between that newsroom really is more like family than I think like colleagues. And in the trial, I think what has been really remarkable to see is that even the prosecution's case, as Tim mentioned, is so farcical. It's really all over the place. They were asking what 1984 was in open court, which I was like, there's like so many layers of irony here. What the Stand News editor has been doing really is just defending journalism, defending the profession of the media before the court, on behalf of our whole industry, right? And I think that has been like, I think for a lot of journalists in Hong Kong, just like such a remarkable thing to see, because it is clear that like the media, not just Stan News, I think just the Stan News in particular and Apple Daily in particular, but the media in general was seen very much as part of the problem in 2019, right? And they were seen, we were seen as part of the problem as much as like the protesters were, as much as schools were, as much as education was, right? So when the NSL sort of came to play, right, I think there was very strategic kind of picking of cases from different baskets to make points on different things. And Stan News, I think was the media case.
Is it being covered heavily in Hong Kong? So are scenes from the trial, or is the statements, any of this testimony and so on, available for ordinary people in Hong Kong to be following?
Yeah, so people are translating a lot of that. I mean, they've been documenting and then also trying to translate it into English. So I think all of that's like work in progress that's happening largely out of Taiwan. But I would say, I mean, I think the real challenge is that the court process has been so excruciatingly slow.
Yeah.
And so like, and like most media outlets have either shut down or very tiny, like have been reconstituted in the wake of the NSL. And people just don't have resources to be able to go to like each and every one of these hearings. Plus they drag out over such a long period of time that like really like the momentum, right? We just like as journalists, we don't know when to weigh in. We don't know like when is the moment to like do the big story on Stan News or do the big story on anything, NSL 47 or any of the other cases, right? And like I think that's been like such a challenge because if it like think about it in the American context, right? If a trial like goes on for over a year, like at what point do you as the media try to cover it and like, hold public interest, right? And I think that has, I don't know if it's deliberate, I don't know if it's a function of just how overloaded the court system is, but the result, right, is that I think a lot of this stuff has just been like buried or forgotten and just dragged on.
Yeah.
So let's take a little bit of a cue here. People in the room with questions. So I see one, okay, so one and two at the very end and three, 1, 2, 3, okay? And then we'll take them from online.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us. So I am one out here, and I grew up in Hong Kong, and during the protest I was there. So thank you so much for writing this. But my question is more into like, why should people in the West want to hear about this? Because like now Hong Kong is a story that's very much swept away. And in my mind, like there's like a certain legacy of like this protest in the like world struggle towards like human agency and like democracy, quote unquote democracy. But there's also the part where we see a lot of what authoritarian governments or regimes do from Hong Kong, and especially if we're bringing this back to the law, like Hong Kong has been such a great like common law jurisdiction. Like people think that it has the rule of law for a long time, and it just dramatically like deteriorated so quickly over the past few years. And if you could just speak a little bit more about like the legacy of the protests.
Yeah, in terms of like why should like Western readers care? I mean, I think one of our it was very deliberate for us to angle the book around people and people's stories, right? Because like to an average reader, a Western reader, I mean, the message is like, imagine your life one day was like a certain way, you like went out with your friends and like you just like had a normal life, you went to school, you had a normal job, and then literally it felt like everything in your city was like falling apart around you and everything was at risk of just collapsing, right? Like how would you react and how would you feel, right? And so I think everybody in our book, probably with the exception of Reverend Chu, because he's been in the game, for so long, 3 young people, like everything changed for them in June of 2019. And I think that's a message that's like, bigger than just Hong Kong, right? I mean, Ukraine too, as well. Places in the US as well, right? I mean, your life can go along one way and then something so dramatic and so fundamental kind of like shifts everything around you, right? And like how do you shift with it, right? And I think that's why like we really want people to connect with like these personal stories. And then layered under it obviously is this warning too that like, okay, if that's happening on like a day-to-day life institutionally, right? You know your courts is one thing, the media is one thing. The thing to us that was so stunning is how fast this all happened. I mean, it was shocking and staggering in its speed. I mean, like we would like wake up and like, more mass arrests were happening. We wake up and like, more different like things were being instituted in schools with like mandatory, national security education and all of that. And now, as I think we all sort of recognize, Hong Kong is just like a stunningly different place than it was before June of 2019. And so I think that's sort of like the lesson that we want to bring. Like, these things are very, very fragile and like they have to sort of be sort of protected, or we have to be aware of like, the fragility of things around us.
The scenario that has played out is what we all thought might happen, or many people feared would happen in 1997.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so the world's media all descended,
Right.
me among them, in Hong Kong in 1997 to watch it happen, and it didn't. Sir.
Yes. So I want you to talk about the role of the media and journalists during that period of time, that protest. Is it something that actually are able to be like neutral or being like objective to do reporting? Because I heard about there's a lot of protesters on the ground that they actually screen the journalists. Like, if you're from Stand News, it's good to go. If you are from, well, like some other, like maybe from the establishment, maybe,
Yeah,
that they are like blocking them or even like doing something like really bad to them,
yeah.
right? So the media at that time for the sake of like getting more views, maybe there's a lot of them also very like towards like Stand News, that kind of stance, so that they can have more support. So can you talk about that, like how the media able to be objective at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. I think two things. There definitely was, members of or people taking part in the protests who felt that, TVB and other places had become, super kind of like biased in one direction. And they certainly faced difficulties occasionally trying to, set up their cameras, and they would, people would put their hands in front of them, things like that. On the other side of it, I think, at Hong Kong Free Press has talked about this. The Stand News editors talked about this in an academic book that was published after the protests. They faced pressure from the protesters as well, because protesters were really upset when people would post like photos that would include people's faces, or they would especially when the break-in happened, right? When Brian Lung, as he is now, took his face mask off and started addressing the crowd there. There was a lot of pushback on the media for posting the photos, arguments about what is in the public interest, about what happens in public spaces, what rights to privacy that protesters do and don't have. So I think there's a lot of pressure on that, and Stand News editors have talked about that they got tons of phone calls and emails, and their Facebook pages got flooded by people taking part in the protests who were saying, don't write this, take this down, this is making the protesters look bad. So I think there was tension on both sides of that, right? There was stuff coming from the police and the establishment saying you guys only film the bad stuff, you only look for the action on the streets, and you're all following around the cops waiting until they make a mistake. And on the other side, there's protesters saying, hey, you shouldn't be publishing this, you should take that down, edit this, censor that. So I think there was a lot, it wasn't just one-sided. I think there was a lot of demands being made of journalists at the time. For us, I'll freely admit it was a bit different being a foreign journalist there compared to Hong Kong journalists. The level of kind of, especially from the police, it certainly got bad towards the end, towards kind of all journalists that were there. But in the beginning, I certainly, and I think Shibani, me to probably more extent because I'm a white guy, didn't get yeah, shocker. I didn't. I certainly didn't get right away the kind of harassment that I saw some Hong Kong friends and local journalists getting. Right, they would sometimes let me walk places or do things, and I wasn't getting shouted at. In the way that they were. By the end, I think we all got we're all getting it kind of pretty badly from the police. But certainly at the beginning, there was a sort of tiered system there that was in play, and I certainly felt for my Hong Kong journalists and my friends that are journalists there, because they were, facing a lot of difficulty really kind of from early on.
I think just like to add on the question of like neutrality, right? I do think that like, in general, right, even though I think it's quite clear that like most media who were on the street felt very, very strongly about what they were seeing, because we saw it firsthand and you can't like not react emotionally about it. I mean, I think like it's always clear that our role is to like take a little bit of a step back, right? And I think there were points that even in our book we tried to be sort of more analytical about strategies and stuff, and like what went wrong at different points of the movement. One of them was the PolyU siege, right? I mean, that was even just from a purely like protest strategy move, a really, really bad one, because it just ended up being surrounded and a lot of the sort of core movement were arrested, right? But it also, you know, like in watching some of the documentaries now, which we were talking about, you know, you realize it was actually quite harrowing and horrific, right? I mean, there was like people who wanted to leave and weren't allowed to leave. It was like, it was much more layered and sort of much more nuanced, right? And I think, you know, with benefit of hindsight, it's sort of our role to kind of like look at this in a very clear-eyed, you know, way and sort of analyze everything as it was as a whole, you know, that is our job fundamentally, even if we have sort of very emotional feelings, you know, following that.
Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, I was also a journalist during the protests, and one thing that I read from elsewhere, I think you didn't mention it today, is that you decide to not go back to Hong Kong after writing this book. I was just wondering, like, how the decision was made and how do you make sense of this decision, and how do you continue, or do you feel there's like that you're still going to continue writing on the Hong Kong story, or do you think like maybe because like that's the price you have to give like for writing the truth that you're believing in, and the price is you can't go back and can't continue reporting on Hong Kong eventually?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, obviously we are foreigners, right? And like we have no family ties to Hong Kong. Seem to be many people in this room, and I think like obviously that's a privilege. And you know, when we decided to write this book, I think like even in approaching other journalists and other people to kind of help us with different elements of the production of this book, everybody with ties to Hong Kong and family in Hong Kong said that they wish to be anonymous. And I mean, I think that was very stark to us. I mean, I think we already kind of knew that like in doing this, it would mean sort of giving up our ability to go back. But then when it was reflected back at us of the decisions of others to be like, we will definitely help you and this is important, but we need to be anonymous, it was like, okay, it's pretty clear that like this is sort of the price. And then, you know, eventually Tim and I also started experiencing some issues with like visa, and Tim got a complaint for his story to the national security sort of police, though nothing, you know, came out of it. And it just felt like, you know, if like we didn't leave ourselves, we would sort of be forced to leave. And, you know, just personally, that felt like a very like, it was very anxiety causing to kind of live through that period of just thinking that in like 1 week your visa could be, you know, just like not renewed, and then you have to like move your whole life. And that was during COVID, so that was issues, you know, with that as well. And so I think we took the decision to kind of leave before we were sort of forced to. And then, you know, in the interim period, we've made quite a few trips back to Hong Kong. And I know, like, I personally, I have a few more stories coming out this year that I think I can be much more, like, I can like push a bit more on that reporting, because I know I'm not going to go back. And like it's sort of pretty clear to me. But I think after that, it's true. Like we won't be able to go back. We won't be able to report on the ground. And I think that really limits you as a journalist in a huge way. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a trade-off, right? I mean, I think like, you know, we see this book and some of the other stuff that we've done as sort of like, you know, our sort of like contribution to kind of the narratives around 2019, and like if the trade-off is, you know, we can't sort of continue operating in Hong Kong, I think it's sort of a worthwhile trade-off. It wasn't easy.
Do you see this book as being a violation of the national security law?
This is all the law minds are in the room here. Maybe I can take your opinions. I don't know. I mean, I think, look, I think the lines, right, the lines around the national security law, around the reimagination of sedition, of what could come with Article 23, though they say it will be retroactive. You know, they've said that about other things too. That it's very unclear still. You know, I explained.
Have you taken advice from lawyers?
On this book?
On this book.
Yeah, yeah, certainly on parts of it and through the publisher, things like that, yeah. I think, you know, what's going on, and since we're in law school, you know, with the law and the courts in Hong Kong is it's like, it's not fully formed yet, right? It's like we don't know all of what we don't know. We don't know, like, you know, how long the trials will take, or what the you know, if the pleading guilty will get you a good deal. Like, we don't know, and so all of this is kind of like, it's still forming in a way. Like, I kind of picture it in my mind as just like I don't know, like a blob of clay, and it hasn't been fully made yet, right, into what it is. So there's just so much unknown that when you look at like a book or, even certain articles, sometimes that come out, it's very unclear as to kind of what, what could be deemed illegal now, what could be deemed illegal in the future, because, as John Lee said, Article 23 is gonna come this year, more likely than not. So yeah, a lot of red lines that I think are deliberately maybe, and also somewhat indeliberately kind of unknown.
We have a few of the, give us an online question.
Yes, sure. So there's a comment from Alvin Chang, and just to follow up on what you have mentioned about like being fragile. He said just to push back on this narrative of fragility, as with bankruptcies, things happen slowly and then quickly, suddenly. So the post and Exile Hong Kong authorities would never have acted as quickly as they did if they hadn't been politically captured years ago. So why was there no interest in covering events when such coverage could have made a difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I think there certainly was a lot of coverage of that stuff, in 2014 and after. I think also you're always battling against the media environment, against the world where there's a lot of stories that are drawing a lot of interest from editors, from the people that are your bosses, and you're not always going to, as much as the stories might feel super important to us and are super important, you're competing with an entire globe of events and things where in every city people feel like their story is kind of, the most important, most impressing one to be told.
Yeah, and I mean, the truth is so much of our media narrative is shaped by what happens in Washington, and like, that's just the reality of it. I know I work for the Washington Post, so that's probably especially true for me, but also the Atlantic. And I think that, what happened on 2019 as well was that Hong Kong was on the US radar in a huge way.
Yeah.
So that was also driving a lot of like news and narrative and a lot of decisions, right? I mean, really what happened in 2019 was a fundamental like reshaping of Hong Kong's foreign policy too, and foreign relations with both the UK and the US. So, I think that's also what made it so.
Yeah, in short, I think other institutions also were fine to go along with, the way Hong Kong is progressing. The US and other places didn't see it, a reason for alarm at those times, unfortunately.
Just a very quick piece of advice from a Hong Kong lawyer. Would you please don't get your discount below national security law sentence minimum.
Okay.
And also there was a question what was your thinking on whether reporting in your book on how the US considered giving refugee to Joshua Wong might be used in evidence against him by Hong Kong prosecutors? On a broader level, do you think there's anything you as like international journalists might do differently now after your experience on this story?
Yeah, so on the Joshua Wong case, obviously it's something that we considered very, very carefully. I mean, because we're publicly recorded and to like sort of protect the people that we spoke to around him, it's not easy for me to say too much about that. But obviously our emails are open, so anybody can reach out to us at any time. But, basically, I think that after we spent months, sort of reporting that story out, including with people in and around Joshua himself, and I think, there was a sort of collective agreement that the public interest in the US decision was very, very strong, and that that was sort of like worth kind of reporting out and documenting, and we were pretty careful in how we chose to word specific things.
Maybe I sort of realizing there wasn't a lot of background in the question. Not everybody in the audience will have read the book yet. I'm sure they will go buy it now. But just the quick background is that Joshua Wong, you report that Joshua and his people who were acting on his behalf were inquiring of the US government, could he get asylum?
Correct.
Could he be somehow, airlifted out of Hong Kong to a safe, to safety by the US?
Yes, and the answer given essentially by Secretary Pompeo was no. And obviously this was an administration that portrayed itself as very radical, willing to do all sorts of things to counter China, and what we would told in our reporting was that there was an assessment that this was a very different China and a China that the US wouldn't have had much to negotiate with over potential kind of asylum bid. And that was pretty stunning to us too, because it was essentially the Trump administration admitting, right, that like they saw China as like pretty powerful and like too hard to negotiate with compared to 1989 and 2012, when there were two previous very high profile cases of Chinese citizens that got asylum, and that asylum was negotiated by the US government.
Also, there's a question from Ken Wasserman. Has there been any, I guess he means any Chinese or Hong Kong laws addressing any kind of police brutality during the democratic movement or like demonstration?
No, there was, I mean, some people might remember there was so much stuff happening, kind of these moments that feel like important and big at the time fade a bit. But there was this international police group that the government put together, made up of policing experts from other Commonwealth countries who were going to look into kind of the certain actions by the police. I think their efforts were stymied. It wasn't what people anticipated, and they ended up. There was kind of one report that was issued, and no, nothing came of it in terms of kind of consequences for the police officers. No.
No police officers were ever disciplined, to your knowledge, for any of the incidents?
Not like
Not through the
within
court system,
court, yeah.
perhaps.
Not through the court system, possibly internally,
Not that we're aware
not
of.
that you're aware of. So let's take a few more from within the room. So 1 back there and 2 over here and 3 there, okay.
Just so you could see me properly, so how would you describe the current state of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong?
Yeah, certainly, at the moment, I definitely at a low. I think there's questions now of just how you possibly move forward when the space for any sort of dissenting view is so constrained that and obviously. And then that's just kind of, I guess, in terms of just dissent and protest in that way. But then the formal channels into the legislative council, into the district council have disappeared, right? I mean, they might say that you could be, pro-democracy and you can run, you can win, you can jump through all the hoops that they've created. But I mean, so far it's proved impossible, and I think that it will continue to prove impossible. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of 2 things, talk of kind of how to move forward and what manner to move forward. And then the other thing is kind of looking at the diaspora community and the people that have left and activism abroad, different kind of lobbying effort, a few different things, I guess, lobbying efforts for kind of laws and changes to policies towards Hong Kong. And then another focus of kind of making Hong Kongers, welcome and kind of integrating into the new communities that they're arriving in. So I think those are kind of the things that are most kind of taking place at the moment. But in terms of kind of in Hong Kong, it's certainly at a historic level, I would say.
Sorry, I'm getting there. Yes, you in a second.
So thank you for sharing with us. I want to ask about regarding the trials that's ongoing right now for July 21st events. To my knowledge, much of the attention of Hong Kong independent news commentators has been focused on scrutinizing the session that you revealed that the government had prior knowledge to the events happening. And with due respect to sensitive sources, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about if this was like revealed to you much later after the event?
Yeah, it was reported out in our reporting for the book specifically, so not at the time. I don't know what should I say.
Yeah, it wasn't something, I guess the question is, it wasn't something that we like knew and we like kind of withheld or things like that. No, I mean, it came about as, it was an event that I think, again, I'll reference her, Bao Choi had done a lot of reporting to reveal some of the people that were there and kind of their connections. And we just felt like it was an incident that was so kind of monumental and telling in a way that we wanted to try to make some more inroads, although it's quite difficult. So yeah, just that all kind of came about as part of reporting on the book project. I think maybe some things that made part of reporting on the book project easier is that time has passed, and also people have left Hong Kong, and I think sometimes it's people are more comfortable speaking now than they were when they were in the city.
Thanks so much for the great work, and I'm sure this type of reporting is not like others. You're dealing with a superpower, and obviously there is a lot of risk involved as well. I think we've come to a point. I came from Hong Kong originally, but lived here for a long time, and I wasn't there in 2019, but I was just participating a little bit in 2014. So obviously, it's a chain of events pivoting at that time, and then halted by the pandemic as well as the security war and so on. So right now it seems like it is in a stalemate, it's in stagnant. It's like not going anywhere. A whole bunch of people kept in jail, although under custody, not under not really like went through the proper procedure, although they were hearing, but they're still behind bars. And then internationally, obviously, there will be a lot of incidences, more severe, catching on the attention and so on. So from the media standpoint, I was just wondering, also from the legal standpoint, since this big security law is like subject to interpretation, it's like whatever they say, then this would apply, and this would make this so-and-so individual deem another 39 months in jail or something like that. So I was just curious from these aspects, how, for example, the editorial board would see what would be newsworthy to keep it alive, or because obviously it's an ongoing thing, or would this, once upon a time, really, really great city be slowly dying under this encroachment? And from the legal standpoint, obviously there is a lot of things to be still explored in terms of how, in that case, in the long term, this kind of ridiculous law would be applied in the city, as well as how the other places would use it as a reference. I was wondering, if there would be any light down the road, or if this is going to be like right now is obviously very grim to pan out,
So I guess on the first question, like what would be sort of newsworthy, I would say I think a lot of the focus now in Hong Kong has shifted to like businesses and the business environment, and how like a lot of companies are actually leaving, due diligence firms leaving Hong Kong in the same way they've sort of left China. I know that even at the time that we were leaving, or before we left, whenever we spoke to diplomats, one of like their main thing that they wanted to interview us about or like report back to their headquarters was the state of the legal system in Hong Kong. I mean, how much can you still trust Hong Kong's common law courts? And so I think people will still be paying attention to that, because Hong Kong's sort of role as a center for arbitration, finance, all of that hasn't really diminished or gone away, right? Because even the sanctions and all that, we never touched the financial system whatsoever. So I think in that context, a lot of companies, a lot of people, a lot of lawyers are still trying to like figure out like, when do we kind of pull the plug, when do we stay, do we go? And reporting around that, I think, has really helped, inform that. I mean, like, even though, the New York Times obviously has shifted their headquarters to Seoul, and, a lot of news organizations have sort of scaled down, probably because they had to with the visa issues and so on. Places like Bloomberg, Reuters, the Wall Street Journal still operate there, so you do see a lot of that financial reporting come out still, and I think that will continue to be sort of pretty newsworthy. The other thing I would say is the Jimmy Lai trial, I'm sure, will be extremely newsworthy, because he's such a high-profile individual, and I think that trial itself will reveal so much about the Hong Kong legal system, that I think that will sort of merit coverage, for sure. And then on the second question about like light at the end of the tunnel, or sort of hope, right? I mean, yeah, it's definitely like hard to kind of like see that, but it's still there if you look. I mean, there's still people who write letters to political prisoners, and there's still those like coordinated efforts to support people who are in jail. There's still what obviously the government calls soft resistance, but different kind of forms of people trying to express their like discontent in sort of different ways. I mean, I think it's like people's hearts or feelings haven't changed at all, you know. It's just whether or not they can kind of express it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when I came to Hong Kong, I went to cover the opening of the Zhuhai, Macau bridge, the kind of first weeks that it was open, right? And there was a lot of tourists from the mainland coming. And it's probably the first story, maybe one of the first stories, or if not the first one that I wrote about Hong Kong. And so an HKU journalism student came along with me, and we were having lunch afterwards, and she was talking about being in high school during 2014 and wanted to pursue journalism. And and she just said to me, after 2014, and she said, but that will never happen ever again in Hong Kong. And then a few months later, 2019 happened, right? And so I think that there's never, counting on Hong Kong, has been, people have done it in the past and been proven wrong. So the city's definitely different. I think, it's less vibrant. I think unfortunately a lot of institutions have been eroded or have disappeared, but I don't think it's, a finished or kind of dead place by any means.
What impact do you hope that your book will have?
I think the first thing we want to do is make the Hong Kong story reach like a different audience, and I think that's what sort of like books can do, and especially character-driven narratives. It can reach sort of a crowd that like would not normally pick up a book about Hong Kong, but because it's about young people, activism, or whatever, maybe other topics that they might be interested in tangentially, that will be a way of sort of getting out that message.
And I think also just we've written about it in news stories about Hong Kong, but just this way of this rewriting history that's going on, not just about 2019, but when you see the pillar of shame removed, when you see all of that stuff taken away, this kind of erasure of 1989 and the importance of Hong Kong, I think we wanted to write that down somewhere, because the government certainly doesn't seem to be easing up on its efforts to kind of recast 2019 and then go even further back and kind of change the narrative of Hong Kong.
Your book, especially your afterword or your final section, is quite tough on the US government.
Mhm.
So were you trying to convey a message there, or are you, neutrality and so on? You respect the neutrality of a journalist, but are you actually trying to promote some kind of US policy or response?
Definitely not promote or sort of advocate for any US policy response, but like so many people always say like, oh, you're like critical of the Chinese government, like CIA funded, all you black hand media journalists. And I mean, that's definitely not true. We can like hold all different institutions to account here. And I think one of the ones that needed to be held to account in any sort of history kind of documenting the what happened in 2019 is the US government, right? Because, truly like the amount of attention we saw in Washington towards the Hong Kong, cause or the pro-democracy cause was crazy. I mean, like we've never seen anything like that in any other country we've sort of covered in Southeast Asia, even Myanmar when we were living there at the time, and President Obama visited, whatever. But you had like congressmen, like lawmakers showing up on the streets of Hong Kong and joining protests. That was like not something that was like normal or had really been seen before anywhere else that we had covered. But then, when everything sort of, ended and like it was sort of tough to figure out ways forward, one of the most helpful things they could have done is offer a lifeboat policy to Hong Kong people, immigration pathway, similar to what was done in the UK, similar to what was done in Canada and Australia, and it just never materialized, right? And the same people who showed up on the streets of Hong Kong were the ones who were blocking it. And I think to us that was like it's sort of just like a real indictment of Washington, right? And the amount of follow through, even on causes that they claim this bipartisan support, that they claim to care about. And I think it has been, really difficult for the lives of average Hong Kong people here, right? Deferred departure is not exactly a solid ground to stand on. You have to wait and see if that will be renewed. I mean, in our book, actually, when like the sort of main narrative of our book is Tommy leaves on a boat from Hong Kong to Taiwan with 4 others, gets stuck in a Taiwanese sort of like holding detention center, and they got resettled in the US through negotiations with the Taiwanese government and the State Department. Not all of them even have that sort of status or their ability to work here, and they were resettled in 2021. So it's been almost 3 years. And that's it's pretty disappointing.
We only have like 1 minute left. So within that, I just wanna, in addition to thank you for coming and sharing this, it's been fascinating. Ask you to end with maybe a few recommendations. As you've mentioned, there are a lot of people who have come out. The Hong Kong diaspora has really grown. There's a lot of people here in New York, as we have all noticed. And people are writing.
Yeah.
They're writing their own accounts. There are a lot of videos, documentaries, formal, informal. Some have been entered into competitions and so on. Could you give us maybe just 2 or 3 recommendations, people who want to see something that you think is really good, that tells the story well, what should they be looking for?
We really liked Blue Island because I think conceptually it works kind of similar in framework to our book where we start with sort of 89 as well and actually before the migration during the Great Famine and Cultural Revolution. Blue Island does the same. I mean, it is just like a brilliant documentary in sort of weaving together different narratives, including the 1967 sort of protests in Hong Kong, riots in Hong Kong, along with the Tiananmen aftermath, and then 2019. I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah, also a documentary that I think kind of didn't go noticed when it came out is it's a French documentary. I will spare you all in my French pronunciation. It's called Operation Yellowbird. It's available online, I think through Amazon or one of the streaming services for like $1.99 or $3.99. A French journalist made it in Hong Kong. I guess it came out probably maybe 2018 probably around 2018. She got incredible access to a lot of the people involved in Operation Yellowbird, bringing dissidents from Tiananmen to Hong Kong and then resettling, and she got incredible access to a lot of French diplomats who were involved. Unfortunately, a number of them passed away in the past 2 years. So she has really good, footage of them talking about with Wu Kai-shi and with Martin Lee and with this whole generation of activists who are now, unfortunately, either in jail or have stepped back from publicly speaking about this stuff. So it's super interesting. The French involvement in that whole thing, I think, was pretty unknown to us. Super cool documentary. If it has subtitles, and obviously the interviewees are speaking in English. So very interesting historical record with some players that have remained very much kind of behind the scenes until very late in their lives. Yeah.
Okay, so and of course, we also want to pitch again Among the Braves as an excellent source of information about what happened during that amazing year plus in Hong Kong. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.